Welcome, first-time listeners and those that come back week after week. I appreciate you, and before I go too far, I want to give a special thank you for listening to my friends in Honduras and here in the States, the city of Atlanta, Georgia, as I have noticed a large uptick in downloads from these two locations. Thank you, and I do see you, and I do appreciate you out there. I also want to say thank you to many of you who sent me a congratulations email on the 100th episode from last week through the Substack page. I appreciate that and the kind words. And if you have not subscribed, check out the show notes, click on the hyperlink, and join for free. As besides being able to contact me directly, you can read way deeper on the discussions we have in the podcast each week through a hand-picked selection of text by yours truly, as I want to encourage you to go way deeper than I do in these discussions when the desire hits. In regards to responding via email, I always try and I respond to everyone as very best I can. So if I haven't responded to you yet, please be patient with me. But if you haven't subscribed yet, I strongly encourage you to do that. We're actually closing in on 100 active followers on Substack. And yeah, this is not the Joe Rogan podcast by any stretch of the imagination. But for me, having 100 people who engage and respond to the topics that we discuss, well, it does my heart good. So thanks for listening in. This podcast isn't about mass marketing or accumulating millions of followers, but it's about taking some sophisticated topics across all facets of philosophy and theology and wisdom literature, which is the genre that we're really focusing on here and have been focusing on for weeks now, and then breaking it down to a key concept or two that you can use in your life when you finish up with listening in and then maybe following up with some additional reading. It's about being practical and clear rather than intellectual. But again, I appreciate you for listening, and I hope I can deliver some value to you today that you can use in your life. By the end of this episode, as you can tell from the title of it, what the bleep was I thinking? We have one goal today, that you understand how and why you make the decisions that you do and how to avoid those bad decisions. I think sometimes in the midst of life, it's hard to appreciate how great life could be if we stop doing the things that are bad and make consistent good decisions on the micro things, which then accumulate to make a big difference in our overall life's trajectory. I mean, daily, if you think about it, we make little decisions over and over again. Hundreds of them every day. Eat this, say this, do this, watch that, don't do that. All day is a series of decisions. And what if we could harness our mind and understand how we arrive at those decisions and learn to self-regulate the things that lead up to those decisions? Well, I think real change could happen. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But before we get there, last episode we talked about St. Augustine. He was an amazing philosopher and a theologian from the medieval time period, and we used his teachings to illuminate the problems with our modern version of the American dream. And today, oh, do I have a fascinating, controversial, stigmatizing, telenovela drama type figure for you. Man, this guy was so hated by the establishment of the church that they even tried to poison him to get him to shut up. You know, you just got to love a guy like this. I know I do. And I hope you will too. Let's just say the traditional church hierarchy of the medieval period, they didn't have our hero for the day on their Christmas card mailing list. His teachings profoundly impacted later eras, with his impact being felt into the Renaissance and ultimately to the Enlightenment. Yet many people just don't know him well, or even heard of him at all. But after today, you will know him, and you will know how his teachings are incredibly significant to society and culture, and how his teachings can impact in your own life to make better decisions and to know and understand yourself better. The individual's name, without further ado, is Peter Abelard. He lived from 1079 to 1142 CE. So let's get to him, his story and his profound impact on culture and society, and how you can use his teachings to make better decisions. So Peter Abelard, he was born in France. He was identified from a very young age as a brilliant student. He was one of those students that obviously was intellectually superior to pretty much everybody else that was around him. He didn't have the over prideful parent type who'd say, "Oh, my young Jimmy or Susie, they're just so very, very smart." No, not that kind of smart. Peter Abelard was just brilliant, if not a genius during that time. That ultimately will demonstrate in his writings and his philosophy and his accomplishment that he was literally centuries ahead of his contemporaries in many ways. It appears that Peter found his passion and recognized his own skill in intellectual pursuits at a very young age, and he gave up a rather large inheritance, and his family's name even had a knighthood, and he gave that up in order to become nothing more than a wandering scholar and to study philosophy. After many years of study and developing his intellect, Abelard became a celebrated teacher in Paris and was one of the founding members, or at least very instrumental in founding the University of Paris, one of the most important intellectual institutions in Europe. Most of what we know about Abelard and his life comes from his own autobiography, self-titled History of Calamity. Wow. I think from the title alone, we can figure out pretty quickly that his life was not easy for him. And it wasn't, not by any stretch. There was no simple life of quiet contemplation in the ivory tower of academia for this guy. And his autobiography recounts maybe one of his most famous and one of the most talked about parts of his life, which was his passionate and tragic relationship with his lover and eventual wife, Heloise. So let's talk about this story first, because it's literally a fascinating tale. And you can read all about this tale because it's well documented. But anyway, so Heloise, a young lady, she was the niece of Canon Fulbert, who was a highly respected clergyman in the Cathedral of Paris. Unfortunately, it will turn out, for Abelard, he was extremely attracted to Heloise, and he decided to seduce her. Bad choice. Abelard, to get access to Heloise, he convinced her uncle to take him into their house as a tutor. And once he was inside, it's kind of the fox in the henhouse case, the inevitable thing occurs, and he used his charm and his wit and his intellect to seduce the young woman. And eventually this undercover affair leads to Heloise becoming pregnant, and she eventually had a son. Now imagine, you're living in the medieval era of Europe, around the 1000s, 1100s. For an esteemed and a prominent religious family of the day, which Heloise came from, the pregnancy, the out of wedlock would have been a scandalous affair. So the two of them were married in secret, which that would have been a pretty common practice of the day. Trying to sweep an unplanned pregnancy under the rug was not out of the ordinary, especially for prominent figures in the community. But If it would have ended just there, it wouldn't have been so bad. But sadly for Abelard, this was not going to be enough to appease her uncle and family that were so furious of the deceit, so furious that the scandal was laid on his house, that they wanted to exact a different level of justice and punishment for the affair and for trashing young Heloise's honor and her purity. So eventually, one dark night, the family, they hired some local muscle thugs. They broke into Abelard's room and they savagely castrated him. I mean, wow. Now that is some serious retribution that Abelard would remember most certainly for the rest of his life. After the castration, Abelard and Heloise were then forcibly separated. He was sent one way to a monastery and she was sent to a convent. And at that point, justice had been exacted according to Heloise's family. Now, Heloise herself, this discussion today is not about her, but she's a fascinating figure in her own right. And although she was never a professional philosopher, she came from obviously a well-educated family, and she was eloquent and she was very capable academically. And eventually she became the abbess of an important convent that was founded by Abelard. But the most interesting component of the relationship were the letters that the two lovers exchanged. Heloise, especially in the letters, is introspective and reasoned and passionate. And the letters, which you can read, by the way, provide quite a remarkable literary monument to love and separation and longing and pain. After Heloise dies, her remains eventually were interned with those of Abelard. So the love story of Abelard and Heloise is an important aspect of his life. But life didn't end with the castration for Abelard. Oh, not by a long shot. As following that disastrous love affair with Heloise, Abelard's academic life marched forward full force. He was just an intellectual genius. But even here, with his brilliant mind, his life was marked by querulous relationships with his colleagues and his superiors. He fought with fellow monks, he fought with bishops, he fought with priests, and well, about anybody who crossed his path, especially very traditional Christians of the day that were disgusted by some of his teachings, and we'll get into those. A lot of this was due to his very unique and very forward-thinking ideas on theological matters. One of his most important works was simply named, quote, Yes and No, end quote. This work, which I love, highly recommend, doesn't do anything but ask a series of 158 theological questions. Then, after each question, Abelard follows up with a list of quotations, biblical quotations, and other expert resource that favor a positive and then a negative answer to the question. This format proved so influential that it was used by many other theologians and philosophers. Thomas Aquinas, in his very famous writing, Summary of Theology, is one of them. I mean, we're going to get to Aquinas, but trust me, because you cannot move through the medieval period without spending time on this figure. But for now, just know that to have Aquinas, this person with such a huge impact, being influenced by our hero of the day, Abelard, is pretty important. It shows the impressiveness and the significance of his work. So that's a good part about Abelard. He had a huge influence on future generations of writers, but the truth is, if I'm going to be honest, his writings were condemned by the church very frequently. He was constantly tormented, so much so that he literally fled to a life of contemplation in the wilderness because life had got so hard for him in the establishment. And he probably would have stayed there if not for his students who were loyal to him and begged him to return to teach. But even after he came back, and he even rises to the spot of an abbot, the anger of the monks was so intense, who were told repeatedly tried to poison and kill him. The bottom line is that in his in-your-face penchant for controversy, an unabashed passion for his views, they followed him his entire life and just turned many people against him. His challenging of the tradition, the static, the closed-mindedness of far too many in the church left him with very, very few friends inside of academic and theological circles, except for his students who just adored and revered him. So you're probably thinking right now, what was it actually that made the traditional church, the traditional academics, so angry at the various teachings and theology of Abelard? I mean, what was the big deal? Well, here's just one example. The church traditionally took the position that universals did exist. Now, a universal truth is something that applies to everything all the time. A universal is nothing more than a quality that makes every human being a human, or that makes every green thing green, or that there are ideas that every human being experiences and sees exactly the same way. This cuts across time and place and culture, especially in a religious context where God created everything. There are universals that apply to everyone all the time because God created everything. This idea held sway all the way back, even before the Christian concept, the Jewish concept of theology existed. It goes all the way back to Plato and the views that there is a universal form of the human being in which every particular human being participates in. Abelard rejected this. This floated about as well as the old saying goes, a lead balloon. Abelard was what is known as a nominalist. And Abelard believed that the idea of universalism is just a nice, fancy theory or idea, but it's not practical. He believed that nothing is real and existent except particulars. This is going to help us in our decision making eventually. And you may ask, why does this even matter so much to the church? Why didn't they just chill? Well, because rejecting the universal has a deep and profound moral implication. And that moral implication is this: the view that man is a free individual, rationally and morally autonomous, untrammeled by the inherent relation to general humanity, and it minimizes the church and maximizes the individual. Let's say that one more time. Abelard's ideas minimize the church and maximize the individual. Now, coming from an abbot inside of the church, as Abelard was, you can imagine why he stirred up such a hornet's nest. And this idea is at the root of all of Abelard's thinking. It was revolutionary for the time. For Abelard, the particular thing is the reality, and the individual is the human center of moral being and activity. You see what he did here? Rather than put God at the center of our everyday actions and decisions, he replaced God with man in the center of actions and activity. This is a cataclysmic shift in perspective. The church hated, and I do mean hated, this idea. Abelard's main work in moral philosophy and demonstrates this perspective shift is in his book, Ethics, Know Thyself. Make no mistake, the title clearly and specifically lays out the argument that Abelard is trying to make. To be moral and ethical, you and I, we need to learn how to know ourselves. We need to look inward, not outward, not upward for answers to live a moral life. he redirects the ethical inquiry inward and argues that it is yours and mine, our subjective state of mind, which determines the wrongfulness of our actions when we make bad decisions. Abelard concludes that God does not condemn sin because our actions are good or bad in themselves, but because we have willingly consented to temptation. Instead of resisting it, because when we do this, we are in contempt of God. Sounds a whole lot like free will, doesn't it? Well, it is. But it's free will on steroids as it moves God down the hierarchy of responsibility of sin to number 2. Because it's your responsibility and my responsibility to make good decisions, not sinful decisions. Now, in our modern world, this seems very logical and it seems very normal, even for many, especially Protestants. But back then, this was revolutionary in thinking. This position even contradicted Augustine, who we talked about last week, who believed that we share in the original sin of Adam, which renders us, you and I, incapable of acting morally without divine grace. We sin or make bad decisions because we have failed to ask for God's grace. The fall put us in the state of sin. The fall of original sin, Adam and Eve, put us in this state of sin, and we must learn to minimize it, but ultimately we are at God's whim. There is no escape, and we will suffer because of it. Abelard rejected this commonly held belief completely. He did agree with Augustine on some things, and he did agree that we share in Adam's punishment. I mean, he did believe when we make bad decisions, we will be punished, but we're not responsible for what Adam did in his life because we're humans. We are responsible for what we do in our own actions. But Adam's guilt or his innocence is not our responsibility, and we don't bear it. The problem with Augustine's view from Abelard's perspective is that Augustine just minimized the exercise of free will and the role of reason way too much, because Abelard believed that free will and reason are key tools in life that we were given from God that inform us about what is good and can be used to control those evil passions and desires if we apply them properly. It is the internal nature of our thoughts that lead to actions that is fundamental in salvation rather than grace, according to Abelard. Abelard also distances the devil from our evil actions, arguing that, the devil acts indirectly, and the devil does place things which attract us towards sin in our way. But if our mind is right and good and strong, the devil does not have power over our free will if we are able to control our mind in our decision-making process. This ultimately removes the devil from the theater in blaming him for why we commit evil acts. This is a bold departure. It empowers the person. It minimizes the metaphysical. So, not only did these views separate Abelard from earlier Christian, highly acclaimed ancient views like Plato that had been studied fervently by the early Christian scholars, but in a way contradicts the church and the institution of the church's views on the very biblical ideas that were formed from the very earliest rise of Christianity. To say it shortly and simply, this was a bitter pill to swallow for many theologians, and you can imagine now why he was so hated by so many in traditional religious circles. I mean, really, Abelard's contemporaries were scandalized by his views, and I don't think that's an overstatement, because what Abelard believed undermined the authority of the church's power to determine what was wrong and seemed to give individuals a radical degree of freedom. subject only to the power of reason, not the church. Abelard also argued that penance was a personal matter between the individual and God. This moral individualism played a decisive philosophical role in the Protestant Reformation that was to come about 400, 500 years later, all the way running through the 1500s to the 1600s, and front runs the liberal tradition, liberal meaning small l, liberal tradition in ethics, which emphasized the role of choice in morality, which is a very, very modern phenomenon. Abelard was, in many ways, centuries ahead of his time in his theology, his philosophy, his perspective, and his ideas about ethics and personal responsibility in life. It's actually really amazing that he formed those so early on in the development of putting the individual above God and above the church. So the church, during the life of Abelard, was nowhere near ready to give up its stranglehold on power in regards to how life should be lived, who should be the dispenser of knowledge, and who should be allowed to dole out penance and forgiveness, because the answer is the church. But enough on the introductory background information. I hope that history gives you a flavor and an appreciation for Peter Abelard, his life, his teachings, and even his relationship with Heloise. They're fascinating and an important component of the medieval time period. But let's have a look at just one of his teachings. And to me, this one teaching is something that all of us can use right now, today, in our own lives, and it ties nicely with some of the introductory material. It was also, this comes from maybe his most controversial writing and really set the church up in arms and in anger against him. So that's the one I want to look at. So in our reading, we focus on the book Ethics, Know Thyself, which I talked a little bit about earlier. This reading hits home hard, but yet this reading also should provide each of us a ton of hope, a ton of peace, a ton of energy to take personal responsibility in our decision-making process. Let's face it, you and I have made some real stupid decisions in our lives. We have. All of us have. I always chuckle at famous people on silly TV show like Oprah-style interviews. And the interviewer will ask such a softball question like, is there anything that you regret doing, or would you have done anything differently? And then the famous person sits back in their chair, straightens up their back, very arrogantly looks and says, No, I would not. I would not change anything that had happened. Okay, maybe it's just me. But the immediate thought to my mind when I hear something like that is, liar, liar, pants on fire. I mean, come on. All of us have said things, done things, or maybe didn't do something that we wish we would have done. I mean, really, we're all human and we all make mistakes. We make bad decisions. Heck, I've made some doozy of big mistakes in my life. Maybe your mistakes have been less than mine, or maybe they are bigger than the mistakes I've made. I don't know, but it really isn't important. We all make mistakes. Oh, as a sidebar, politicians, so I guess now they're trained in their small-minded Republican or Democratic school for new politicians, like ignorant sheep, to never admit when they do anything wrong, like ever, never. I hate that. I hate when they blatantly lie when evidence is sitting right in front of everyone's face and they still won't admit screwing up, often just disgustingly dismissing it or immediately or justifying it or blaming somebody else. It's so icky, so little, so sad that so many tiny-minded and soft-minded people inherit these political offices. And they're not strong enough and they're not tough enough to admit when they're wrong. But hey, today, from Abelard, what I want to discuss from his philosophy, we don't want to be like that. We want to talk about how we can improve, no matter what bad decisions we've made, our decision-making process and how to do it the right way, Peter Abelard's way. That's what we're going to talk about today. Again, For those of a religious persuasion, any religious persuasion, this is perfect relevant, as Abelard's teachings will make perfect sense because God's there. But if you're an atheist or never really exposed to religion, Abelard's teachings still can be used in your life to do a better job of recognizing things that influence your decision making so that you avoid moral and ethical hazards in your life outside the realm of any religious doctrine that says what's good or bad. Yet Abelard argued that sin or temptation in our decision making occurs in 3 steps. But let me de-religious these 3 steps just for our purposes. Just understand, though, that Abelard argued these steps in a Christian context. As when I read this, I thought, geez, this makes perfect sense to avoid bad decisions in every single situation in life. So I'm kind of taking my own creative license to universalize the 3 steps beyond Abelard's Christian perspective on that. So I'm turning the sin into the act of doing something bad or a poor decision. As we already talked about with Abelard, sin didn't happen by just thinking about it. It happened in the action or in the decision to do it. The personal responsibility we each have when we make our decisions and perform the action. So how do we avoid making bad decisions or detrimental decisions in our life? And as I already said, we all make them. And if you have the power of self-reflection and self-monitoring of your mind, you will be way ahead of the game and you will stop making some of the dumb decisions that you make. So if we recognize and internalize Abelard's 3 steps, and it's just 3 steps to bad decisions, if we recognize these, you're going to be able to short circuit the thought early, retrace a new path, and make a new decision. And overall, over time, you begin making a high quality choice more and more frequently. This will help us avoid making dumb, bad, stupid decisions. I know I need this. Maybe you do too. So what are the 3 steps? Well, step number 1, according to Abelard, is a thing called suggestion. You and we need to be on guard for suggestions that something bad is actually a good idea in our daily lives. These suggestions can come from social media. They can come from marketing. They can come from scammer marketeers. They could come from a credit card company trying to convince you to take that vacation you can't afford, or a university telling you that $200,000 in student debt is worth it in the long run. Heck, even a dirty, profit-motivated pharmaceutical company trying to convince you that you need to take a pill to solve some problem. In a Christian context, or a religious context in general, the suggestion comes from the devil. If we think about it, we're bombarded every day with suggestive images and ideas. Our bodies, our financial situation, our health, our happiness, etc., etc. The seeds of poor decision making are sown by suggestions that influence us. The things you watch, the things you listen to, the things you browse on the internet are laying seeds of suggestion all the time that can lead to poor decision making. You know, one of the things I always tell my first year freshman students in the first day of class that are coming into college is this: that one of the toughest parts of becoming educated is that some of you will need to change your group of friends. If the friend group is a bad influence, the chance to get off track and end up dropping out is very high. This is statistically proven. The truth is that the people that you associate with determine a whole lot of where you end up, because they're constantly laying seeds of suggestion. So the first seed of sin, of suggestion, of poor decision making, is not the act itself. It's the intellectual and the mental exercise of suggestion. The better we get at identifying negative thoughts and bad suggestions, the better we become at avoiding it. Oh, by the way, before I go on, if you wake up in the morning, you jump on your work email right away. You scan that. Then you check out your favorite firebrand cable TV news and all the doomsday sayers for your morning news, and you scan some horrible articles and maybe read scan through some forums where people are spouting off. Then you head out to work. You feed your mind with more ideologically angry commentators. You do your work. Then you end your day listening to the same garbage on the way home and then watching it on cable TV at night. Is it any wonder mentally that you're anxious, angry, and distrustful of anyone and anything that doesn't align with your thought processes? What goes in your mind as a suggestion tends to come out. But step one in sin, or poor decision making in general, is a negative, influential suggestion. I think you get that. The second phase, to Abelard. After the seed of suggestion is planted, the second phase is the lure of pleasure. The most obvious is the sensual. Sure, it could be sex, but it could also be food. It could be the magnetic draw of money or whatever. But pleasure emerges from that seed of suggestion as the second phase of poor decision making. Let me go biblical for you. Our friend Eve in the Garden of Eden and original sin. Let's go to the first sin according to the Christian theology. So Eve is approached by a serpent, the devil. And the suggestion was planted. Hey, Eve, look at that incredible tree. Oh, the tree of knowledge. Doesn't it look great? I bet the fruit tastes amazing. And see, right here at this point, if Eve would have followed Abelard's theology of self-control, Eve would have stomped on that serpent and told him, "Get the hell out of here. Shut up and leave me alone," thus terminating the suggestion. But did she do it? Of course not. Of course not. She moved to step 2 and started thinking of the pleasure. Eve walks up to the tree. I kind of imagine this. I'm not saying this is exactly the way it was. When she should have just turned around and ran the other way, and she looks at the beautiful fruit and imagines, oh, how sweet that fruit must taste. And heck, her mouth probably even started to water. And then, oh, that tree even includes the deepest and most profound knowledge, just like God. There you get a little ego boost in there because the serpent had laid that seed of suggestion and told her. And all of a sudden, the fire is kindled in her to eat. The passion is lit. You can imagine maybe some brief internal struggle, but that desire, that pleasure impulse in humans is very, very, very strong. And well, we know the rest of the story. She took a bite. But this isn't just Eve in the Garden of Eden. Not even close. Not by a long shot. Some of us are overcome by the desire for physical pleasure. For some, it's food. It may be a substance, legal or illegal. From cigarettes to sugar to alcohol to cocaine, we're bombarded with the sensation trying to experience pleasure. I mean bombarded with suggestions in the media. Sadly, family are the wrong set of friends, and they lay the seeds for pleasure that are not really pleasure at all in the long run. As Abelard tells us, this pleasure is a trap. And all too often we just give in. Oh, we eat that extra piece of cake. We skip that workout. We have another cigarette. We stay in the bar for those extra drinks. We don't get up early when we should and fall back asleep. We take that nap. We can't shut our mouth in anger. We just have to get that last word. Doesn't really matter what it is. We seek pleasure in many, many different forms. And when those pleasures are laid by the seeds of sin or bad decision, well, it's easy to give in. Abelard says we need to short circuit that pleasure impulse. I'll give you an example, as many of you know, and I've mentioned in many podcasts, I eat a pretty darn healthy diet. Not perfect, but mainly a whole foods diet, probably 80% fruits and vegetables, 20% meat or fish or chicken. The only thing I really eat on a daily basis that is packaged or processed is probably only protein bars, protein shakes, that sort of stuff. But still, when I go into a grocery store and I walk down an aisle and I see those gorgeous pastries, there's my suggestion. If I would actually pick it up and I put it in my cart and take it home, I will then later on trigger that pleasure emotion and I'll think, oh my goodness, I really, really, really want to eat this thing. So what I have to do for me is not buy pastries at all. I have to short circuit the suggestion before it triggers that pleasure emotion. As if I flirt with it, if I'm honest with you, I will eat that pastry if it's in my house. At some point, I'm going to eat it. My willpower just isn't strong enough. That pleasure instinct kicks in too hard. So I have to short circuit the suggestion and take the potential of pleasure off the table when necessary. And we all have those triggers in life in all kinds of different ways that lead to bad decisions, and we need to short circuit them. In all the decisions we make, we need to follow Abelard and avoid that pleasure principle, as it is strong, really strong. No. This isn't just in physical things. Let's say that you want to do a much better job of communicating and talking with someone that you disagree. Because, well, you have that family member, that friend, and you love them and you respect them, but dang, do their opinions on Donald Trump or politics just tick you off. And you easily get triggered immediately, and you start ripping off mean tweets or yelling at someone, or at the minimum just feel violent anger welling up inside of you. Can you use Abelard in those type of situations as well? Well, yes, you can. If the suggestion is avoidable, someone you don't really care about, then don't go to those stupid ideological anger-spewing websites or listen to those radio or cable TV shows that model bad thinking processes. Or for goodness sake, stay off Twitter. But let's say, a tougher example, you have someone close to you and you want to converse with them because you love them or they're friends, and you don't want to, and you want to understand them, even though you know it can be really tough and it could lead to a really bad situation. Well, then the best short circuit of a bad and angry conversation has to come at that emotional level before anything come out your mouth. Maybe, just maybe, start that conversation with, hey, I really just want to hear and understand your opinion on X, Y, or Z, even though you know it will be uncomfortable. And then, most importantly, bite your tongue and keep your fingers off the keyboard and listen. I tell you, this is really hard. And I'm not a master. I'm not even all that good at it sometimes, by any stretch. And I try and work on it, as you should too. But it's important, and give it a try. But back to Abelard. So we went through step 1. We went through step 2. His step 3 in decision making is after we move from suggestion to pleasure, we end up at consent. Let's go back to our friend Eve one last time. She's in the Garden of Evil. The devil laid the seed of suggestion. Then Eve intellectually dreamed of and started lusting towards the pleasure of following through on the suggestion. And then the bad decision happened, and Eve consents to the action. She commits the sin by eating from the tree of knowledge. At this point, We moved from suggestion and pleasure, which occur in the mind, and to Abelard is not a sin, but oh my goodness, once she took a bite, once she opened her mouth and ate, then the cascading effect happens. The pain, the shame, the embarrassment, the self-loathing, or whatever emotion hits when we make a bad decision. But it's not just Eve, is it? We all know that feeling when we kept talking and talking and talking and stuck our foot in our mouth and hurt someone. Or we typed that stupid response to something and we hit send rather than delete. Or we did something to embarrass ourselves or hurt those we love. Or maybe the decision didn't hurt anybody but ourselves. Once we consent to the suggestion and the pleasure and are drawn over the edge, then the sin is committed, the bad decision is made. Heck, if I went to the grocery store, was tempted, brought home the pastry, but then never ate it, but gave it to my neighbor who isn't following my diet, it wouldn't have hurt me in my desire to avoid these foods. The bad decision to mess up my diet would have been avoided. But consent, step number 3, is when the act is completed. So Abelard tells us the 3 steps to making poor decisions, sinful decisions, suggestion, pleasure, consent. Of the 3 steps, our hope, yours and mine, is that we can short circuit the bad decision making early enough. We short circuit the suggestion by avoiding it completely or shutting it out. But let's say the seed of evil or bad decision is laid with suggestion. We still have another chance. We haven't committed any sin yet. We haven't made the bad choice yet. And that is through self-monitoring our thoughts in that pleasure phase. And we notice, wow, I really want to do this, but I shouldn't do this. When we're tempted, and we are tempted all the time. But if we can say, hold on a minute, I don't need to buy this new car right now. Or I need to stop conversing with this person. Or don't say that thing. Or I need to not eat that. Or I need to stop drinking this or consuming that. We can end a lot of bad decisions that we make in our life through self-monitoring during that pleasure phase. To me, just me, seems more logical and easier to shut down bad decisions during the suggestion phase and what we put in our mind and what we let filter through us. Garbage in, garbage out kind of thing. It's a lot easier in the suggestion phase than the pleasure phase. But hey, you need to understand yourself and how your mind works. Just know that you have 2 chances to exercise free will to not make that bad decision. Because if we don't monitor out external thoughts and emotions that come into us, and we can't manage our passions, unfortunately consent, and then we will consent to sin, and we will consent to making bad decisions. The other interesting thing with Abelard is that you don't get to blame anyone but yourself for your poor decisions. Remember that he didn't want to lay everything at the foot of the devil of why we sin. And you can't be laying your poor decisions on somebody else. You can't blame it on your race, your gender, your economic situation, your parents, your spouse. Sure, the suggestion may have been laid by someone else, but you didn't reject it when you had the chance. Sure, someone or something can be tempting you hard to something desirable or pleasurable, but you didn't reject it when you had the chance. So when you hit the phase of consent, and by the way, the word consent literally means in the dictionary, quote, permission for something to happen or agreement to do something. Well, that permission came from you, and you agreed to say or do or act out that negative thing. When you get here, it's on you, and you need to bear the consequences. You need to repent. You need to ask forgiveness. You need to make amends, and you need to self-reflect. so you don't go through the same 3 steps again and again and again and again on the same issue. If you have the humility, the mental strength, and the willingness to change, then you can set your path on one of growth and improvement. If you don't, if not, you will find yourself on a circular path of suggestion, pleasure, consent. Suggestion, pleasure, consent. Suggestion, pleasure, consent in a negative way. And your life is going to be a series of sins and failures without growth. There's some great excuses in there, like it's the fault of this person, that thing, or that patriarchy, or whatever, and you're on your way to a life of poor decision making, characterized by taking no personal responsibility. This, my friends, is what you and I need to avoid like the plague if we hope to become more wise human beings over time. But flip that around. Rather than having negative suggestions, what if you surround yourself with positive suggestions and positive people that are laying seeds of goodness and kindness and wisdom? And in the pleasure phase, it's like you're doing good, positive things for your body, for your mind, for your soul. You can see that pleasure. And then you consent over and over on the positive rather than the negative. That's how these little micro decisions happen. So there you have it. Peter Abelard. I hope this little lesson today from his book, Ethics, Know Thyself, can help you understand how you make decisions. I think it transcends religion and it transcends time, so that all of us today can use it in our decision making. So with that, thanks again for listening. I'm so very grateful you're here. And please go ahead, subscribe to the Intellectual Freedom Podcast Substack page as you can read in full a lot of these same works from Abelard, from beginning to end, without just my interpretation and my analysis of it and my creative license on these works, because boy, I go where I need to go on these things. Take it way deeper than where I go with our discussion. And I hope you have a great week, and we will talk again next week. Hope you make some wonderful decisions this week. Take care. Bye.